Finland entered 1944 in a defensive war it called the Continuation War, a conflict that followed the Winter War of 1939-1940 and Finland's loss of the Karelian Isthmus, Ladoga, Karelia, and other territories. The strategic premise since 1941 had been limited. Cooperate militarily with Germany as a co-belligerent to regain the 1939 frontiers and secure a more defensible line, while preserving independent command and Finland's political system. By early 1944, that premise was under strain. The Eastern Front had shifted after Soviet successes at Kursk and on the Neva and Volkhov sectors. The Leningrad siege was broken in January, opening rail lines and logistics for large-scale operations against Finland. Helsinki's leadership, President Risto Ryti, Commander-in-Chief Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, and the cabinet faced a narrowing path between military necessity, supply dependence on Germany, and pressure from the Soviet Union that had already signaled demanding peace terms and exploratory contacts during 1943. The Karelian Isthmus, between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga, remained the principal approach to southern Finland. Its road and rail axes ran through Viipuri, Vyborg, then west toward Helsinki. Finnish defenses there were organized in depth but unevenly completed, the forward belt known as the VT line, and farther back, the VKT line tied to natural obstacles between Viipuri, Kupersaari, and Taipale. Winter earthworks and concrete work lagged due to labor shortages, frozen ground, and limited cement and steel. The field army had combat experience and competent small unit leadership, but material reserves were tight. By early 1944, Finnish mobilized strength was on the order of 5,000 personnel, including support services. Frontline infantry formations on the isthmus rotated to maintain cohesion, but suffered from artillery ammunition constraints and limited anti-tank assets. Deliveries from Germany in 1943-1944 had improved anti-armor capability with Stugge third assault guns and shape-charge weapons, yet quantities remained modest relative to anticipated Soviet armor. Soviet forces opposite the isthmus belonged primarily to the Leningrad Front, with 21st Army and 23rd Army positioned to attack once the approaches from Leningrad stabilized after the January offensives. Soviet staff work emphasized massed artillery, concentrated armor, and air superiority achieved by proximity to major bases. The Red Army had reorganized combined arms tactics and artillery control since 1942, and by winter 1943-1944, possessed the logistical lift to bring up guns, shells, and bridging equipment on short notice. Intelligence available to Helsinki indicated growing concentrations, but the timing and scale of the summer effort against Finland had to be weighed against simultaneous Soviet planning for operations farther south against Germany. This uncertainty influenced Finnish dispositions. Hold the forward belt long enough to identify the main blow, then trade space for time while concentrating reserves on the decisive sector. Logistics framed Finland's options. Domestic agriculture covered only part of bread grain needs. Imports, predominantly from Germany, were necessary to sustain urban populations and the army. Fuel, lubricants, explosives, precursors, and key munitions also arrived via German channels, often by Baltic shipping, vulnerable to changing naval conditions. Railway capacity within Finland was sufficient for lateral movement along the isthmus, but stockpiles of artillery shells and mortar rounds could not match Soviet expenditure rates. The Air Force, experienced and disciplined, operated a mixed fleet of domestically modified and imported types, but serviceable aircraft and spare parts were finite. In planning documents for early 1944, Finnish staff officers recorded artillery rationing and the need to husband armor-piercing ammunition for critical counterattacks rather than continuous barrage support. Domestic politics and public sentiment reflected war weariness alongside a consensus to avoid occupation and maintain constitutional order. Parliament continued to function. Parties that had supported the war policy expected that diplomatic channels might reopen if Finland demonstrated military resilience in the event of a Soviet offensive. Opposition voices warned that prolonged dependence on Germany risked deeper entanglement, just as Germany's position worsened. In this climate, Mannerheim's authority as a non-partisan commander and elder statesman had weight. He sought to keep strategic choices open, preserving relations with Berlin for supplies while authorizing discreet probes toward peace terms in Stockholm and Moscow. Signals intelligence offered both reassurance and warning. Finnish radio intelligence and aerial reconnaissance tracked redeployments on the Leningrad axis, noting artillery groupings and bridging stocks that suggested preparation for large-scale river crossings and breakthrough operations. Yet, estimates varied on whether the main effort would hit the Isthmus or the Eastern Karelian Front. The General Staff revised contingency plans in January-March, moving engineer units to improve the VT and VKT belts and assigning scarce assault guns to likely armor avenues near the Suma and Tali road nets. War games conducted in late winter emphasized rapid counter-concentration, mobile anti-tank ambushes, and short violent counterattacks under artillery smoke to restore ruptured sectors. Foreign policy signals hardened during the first quarter of 1944. Soviet interlocutors indicated that any armistice would require restoration of the 1940 frontier at minimum, payment of significant reparations, and the disarming or removal of German forces from Finnish territory. Berlin's reaction to Finnish peace feelers was immediate. Deliveries could be curtailed, and military assistance would hinge on Finland's commitment to continue the war. The calculus in Helsinki became a balance sheet of munitions days, grain tonnage, and prospective casualty rates on the Isthmus against the political cost of either rejecting or accepting stringent terms. By April, staff assessments concluded that a major summer offensive on the Isthmus was probable once ground conditions improved. The goal for Finnish defenses was to inflict delay and attrition sufficient to compel Moscow to consider moderated terms, or at least to preserve the Army's core strength for negotiation from a position short of collapse. The goal for the Soviet side, as deduced from force assembly and past directives, was to break through to Viipuri, disrupt the Finnish command system, and create an operational situation that would force a political decision in Helsinki. In both capitals, the stakes were defined in concrete terms: the security of Leningrad and the Soviet northwestern flank, and the survival of an independent Finland centered on Helsinki. The months of January to May thus set the stage. Construction crews and infantry details deepened trenches and anti-tank ditches across snow and thaw. Ammunition trains moved under blackout to forward depots. German liaison missions pressed for assurance that Finland would not seek a separate peace, while offering additional ground attack aircraft and anti-tank weapons if commitments were made. Civil defense authorities in Helsinki updated evacuation plans and shelter usage in case long-range bombardment increased. Each action reflected a constrained arithmetic. Finland needed time, supplies, and a defensible line. The Soviet command sought mass, momentum, and a political outcome achieved through military pressure. As ice receded on Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland, both sides prepared for a test on the narrow ground of the Karelian Isthmus that would, within months, drive Helsinki's leadership to reconsider the entire war policy. The opening of 1944 on the Karelian Isthmus combined reconnaissance, artillery registration, and force concentration that pointed to a summer decision. After the January lifting of the Leningrad siege, the Leningrad front shifted artillery groups and bridging trains toward the northwest approaches between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga. By March, Soviet engineer units marked assault lanes through Finnish minefields, sighted forward ammunition parks, and rehearsed river crossing drills. Finnish front troops reported increased patrol pressure, more frequent harassing fires, and night movements of tracked vehicles audible beyond the tree line. Headquarters in Mikkeli judged that the main effort would fall on the Isthmus once soil conditions allowed heavy guns and armor to move off paved roads. Command arrangements on both sides reflected the scale of what was coming. In Helsinki, Commander-in-Chief Mannerheim retained overall authority. Chief of the General Staff Axel Airo coordinated reserves and artillery allocations. On the Isthmus, the front was held by corps that would in mid-June be grouped under a dedicated Army of the Isthmus to improve lateral control. Finland's aviation was directed by Air Force headquarters, with fighter groups responsible for point defense over Viipuri, Lappeenranta, and the rail junctions behind the front. German liaison missions remained in place, reporting Berlin's readiness to send limited air support and anti-tank weapons if Finland confirmed continued resistance. On the Soviet side, the Leningrad front commanded by Leonid Govorov prepared the Vyborg Petrozavodsk Offensive, with two armies facing the isthmus. Air support came from the 13th Air Army, while long-range and rocket artillery were concentrated to open the attack with a timed fire plan. On 9th June, a preparatory bombardment began along the coastal sector and inland around Valkeasaari. Over several hours, heavy and medium artillery, rocket launchers, and airstrikes worked successive lines: forward trenches, communications trenches, headquarters nodes, and battery positions. Registrations accumulated since spring were used to shift fire rapidly as Finnish positions replied with narrower resources. The opening ground assault started on 10th June, when Soviet Rifle Corps advanced behind rolling barrages. In the coastal zone, the Finnish forward battalions were pressed back, and counterattacks by company and battalion groups slowed the pace, but could not restore the line once gaps widened under renewed fire. The VT line, intended as the first continuous defensive belt, was penetrated on multiple points within the first 48 hours. Finnish staff reactions prioritized an organized withdrawal toward the VKT position, tied to waterways and stronger natural obstacles. Road control detachments regulated traffic to prevent jams on the few east-west routes. Assault gun companies were committed to ambush profiles on likely tank approaches, holding fire to short ranges to conserve armor-piercing stocks. Artillery group commanders shifted guns by night to avoid counter-battery fires, using pre-arranged smoke to cover retrograde movements. Air defense battalions redeployed around bridges and railheads west of Viipuri, while fighter squadrons executed standing patrols to intercept ground attack sorties. The speed of the initial Soviet advance shaped political messages in both capitals. In Helsinki, the cabinet received briefings stating that the forward belt had been compromised and that further pressure could bring the enemy to the approaches of Viipuri within days, unless reserves were concentrated and ammunition deliveries improved. German envoys pressed for firmer assurances, offering a composite air detachment and additional Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck consignments routed through Baltic ports. In Moscow, front reports recorded captured trench lines, prisoners, and intact fieldworks, suggesting that Finnish defenses could be dislocated before a stable line formed. The operational timetable, therefore, emphasized maintaining momentum, committing additional armor and artillery to prevent Finnish consolidation on the VKT line. Between 11 and 14 June, fighting coalesced around road hubs leading into Viipuri. Finnish infantry used delaying tactics at village edges and forest lines, mining culverts and creating roadblocks with felled timber to canalize armor. Company-level positions often pivoted around a few machine guns and mortars, covered by pre-planned defensive fires. When pressure grew, platoons pulled back to secondary foxholes, already staked out during spring rehearsals. Soviet spearheads, supported by assault guns and close air support, sought to break through before the defenders could settle. Bridges were prepared for demolition and, where necessary, blown to force detours that consumed hours of daylight. Organizational changes accompanied the tactical fight. On 14th June, the Finnish High Command consolidated control on the isthmus under a single field headquarters to accelerate artillery massing and reserve allocation. Ammunition rationing remained strict. Field guns were assigned daily allowances that prioritized counterattacks and critical defensive fires. The armored element, consisting mainly of Stugee the-3 assault guns and a small number of captured tanks, was redistributed to sectors where aerial reconnaissance indicated deeper Soviet armor groupings. In the air, Finnish fighters flew interception patterns while awaiting reinforcement. The promised German air group, later known as Detachment Kulmi, began transferring to Finnish bases in the third week of June, bringing dive bombers and fighter bombers that would influence later phases. By 15th to 16th June, the VT line had effectively ceased to function as a continuous barrier. The the VKT line became the immediate objective for Finnish troops withdrawing under pressure. The terrain west of Viipuri offered stronger defensive geometry, but the timing was tight. Soviet forces closed on the city's outer defenses, using reconnaissance units to find passable forest tracks and engineers to bridge anti-tank ditches. Finnish demolitions around key nodes attempted to trade infrastructure for time, a calculation weighed against the need to sustain lateral movement behind the line. Civil authorities initiated controlled evacuations from areas exposed to artillery range, loading trains with documents, medical stocks, and industrial tools that could be moved on short notice. The capture of Viipuri on 20th June concluded the opening phase. Finnish rear guards withdrew to previously selected lines, and command posts moved farther west. For the Soviet side, the fall of the city met an early operational milestone and opened approaches toward the Tali and Ihantala road network. For Helsinki, it sharpened the strategic question that had been evident since winter: whether the army could impose enough delay and loss on the attacker to enable political negotiation under conditions preferable to outright collapse. The answer would depend on whether the VKT line and the concentrations at Tali Ihantala could halt or slow the advance. The opening weeks had established the momentum, the terrain, and the command relationships that the next stage would test under greater pressure. Strategic objectives on the isthmus diverged but were concrete. For the Leningrad front, Stavka's directive after January 1944 translated into an operational task: breach Finnish prepared lines, seize Viipuri, and exploit along the road network toward Lake Saimaa to impose a political decision in Helsinki. The main striking power was assigned to 21st Army, with 23rd Army on its right to widen and protect the penetration. Planning figures assembled for the Tali Ihantala sector indicate approximately 15,000 personnel in 21st Army, with rifle divisions reinforced by tank brigades, breakthrough artillery, and guards mortar brigades. Average rifle division strengths on this front were around 6,500–7,000 men. For Finland, the aim was to trade space for time, delay on the VT belt, concentrate reserves on the VKT line, and inflict losses sufficient to make a negotiated armistice feasible while preserving the army's structure. Finnish Ivor Corps initially committed about 5,000 troops in the Tali Ihantala area, later reinforced toward 1,000 as formations arrived from other sectors. Wikipedia. The doctrine underpinning both plans reflected experiences since 1942. Soviet assault method combined a timed fire plan, massed guns per kilometer on the breakthrough sector, and close air support to compress the defender's decision cycle. To enable this, the Leningrad front assembled artillery groupings, including a breakthrough artillery division, multiple artillery brigades, and guards mortar brigades with rocket launchers, supported by the 13th Air Army. On 9th June, the front could call on roughly 817 aircraft in the 13th Air Army, with additional fighters from the Guards Fighter Aviation Corps and the Baltic Fleet Air Arm, raising the theater total to around 1,600 combat aircraft, of which a high proportion was tasked against Finnish targets during June. The plan sought to prevent Finnish consolidation on the VKT line by maintaining operational tempo after the fall of Viipuri. Itsparids. Wikipedia. Finnish planning emphasized economy of fire and centralized control. Artillery, commanded under methods developed by General Vilho Nenonen, used unified firing data and rapid correction procedures to mass battalion and multi-battalion fires onto fleeting targets without expending large registration shoots. This compensated for smaller shell stocks and fewer tubes by increasing the accuracy and simultaneity of concentrations. The intended pattern was to absorb the first shock on prepared obstacles, then deliver sudden, short, high-density fires on assembly areas, road bottlenecks, and armor avenues of approach, coordinated with assault gun ambushes at 300–600 meters to conserve armor-piercing ammunition. These procedures would reach their fullest application at Ihantala, when multiple artillery groups were synchronized to strike advancing formations before they could deploy from march columns. Codenames. Plus 1. Logistics framed the attainable scale of operations. The Leningrad front could move large quantities of ammunition, bridging, and fuel by rail now that the city's lines had reopened. Stocks of rockets and heavy shells supported broad, multi-day bombardments. The Finnish side faced restricted industrial depth and limited imports of fuel, explosives precursors, and grain, much of it tied to German deliveries and Baltic shipping. Ammunition ration lists issued in spring set daily allowances for field artillery and mortars that forced prioritization of counterattacks and critical defensive fires. Rail capacity allowed rapid lateral movement along the isthmus, but the number of serviceable guns, prime movers, and heavy engineer assets could not be expanded quickly. The design of the VKT line sought to multiply the value of what existed by anchoring on lakes, marsh, and the Vuoksi water system to reduce the frontage that had to be held continuously. Air power planning reflected asymmetric resources. The 13th Air Army's objective was to isolate the battlefield, suppress Finnish artillery, and protect Soviet armor as it closed on road hubs west of Viipuri. Finnish headquarters tasked the small but experienced air arm to point defense, artillery spotting, and interdiction of selected columns, where forest roads forced predictable routing. Recognizing the gap in numbers, Mannerheim requested German assistance once the VT line began to give way. Detachment Kulme, an ad hoc Luftwaffe composite wing built around I-SG-3 and 2 JG-54 elements, concentrated roughly 70 airworthy aircraft at Finnish bases by 17th June. Over the summer phase, it flew about 2,700 sorties and dropped approximately 770 tons of bombs, with reported claims against Soviet tanks and aircraft. Its presence was integrated into Finnish fire plans to hit assembly points and crossings at hours of heaviest traffic. Wikipedia. Operational preparations on land were specific to terrain. Soviet engineers prepositioned assault bridging, laid corduroy on soft shoulders, and mapped minefield gaps through reconnaissance and force. Artillery survey teams completed counter-battery plans against known Finnish batteries and suspected alternate positions. The Finnish side deepened ditches and log revetments on the VKT line, camouflaged gun pits, and rehearsed company-level withdrawals to pre-marked secondary foxholes to avoid encirclement. The Armored Division, with Stu-G-3 assault guns as its most effective anti-armor asset and a mixed inventory of older tanks, was assigned to plug armor avenues at Tali and Ihantala road nets. Its employment concept stressed short, violent counterattacks under umbrella fires rather than sustained tank versus tank engagements. Supply lines to sustain these plans diverged in vulnerability. The Leningrad-Viipuri rail axis allowed high daily tonnages, with ammunition parks pushed forward under camouflage. Finnish stocks were dispersed and moved by night to avoid air attack, with strict movement discipline on the few east-west roads. German supply offers in June included anti-tank weapons delivered by sea and air. Finnish infantry platoons consequently integrated increasing numbers of Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks into close-in defense, changing the balance in forest fighting and village edges where engagement ranges were short. Air defense units concentrated around bridges, ferries, and rail junctions, accepting risk in rural gaps to protect nodes essential for reserve shuttling. Wikipedia. Miscalculations were present on both sides. Soviet staff estimates assumed that once Viipuri fell, the Finnish command would lack time to build a stable fire system west of the city. In practice, the density of lakes and the rapid concentration of Finnish artillery and assault guns created repeated fire sacks at Tali and Ihantala that blunted follow-on echelons. Finnish planners underestimated the speed with which heavy artillery and armor could be brought to bear against the VT belt, requiring an earlier and more compressed withdrawal to the VKT line than intended. Air planners in Helsinki initially hoped to maintain broader interdiction, but the sheer volume of Soviet aircraft forced a focus on protecting selected nodes until German air support arrived. The subsequent integration of Detachment Kulme into interdiction cycles partially corrected this, especially against crossing points where coordinated bombing and artillery fixed columns under observation. Wikipedia. +1. Information operations and political signaling formed part of planning. Soviet communiques highlighted the breaching of Finnish lines and the capture of Viipuri to shape expectations about imminent collapse and to apply pressure on Helsinki's leadership during ongoing diplomatic probes. Finnish public statements emphasized the continuity of constitutional government and the defensive nature of operations, while privately briefing Berlin on immediate materiel needs without committing to long-term political guarantees. Within headquarters, Mannerheim and Axel Eiro treated the coming battle as both a tactical problem and a bargaining lever. If the army could stop or slow the advance at Tali Ihantala and adjacent sectors like Vuo Salmi, the government would gain room to negotiate an armistice that preserved state continuity. The strategic goals and the plans built to achieve them thus converged on a narrow map, square west of Viipuri, where roads, lakes, and ammunition ledgers would decide whether Finland could move from co-belligerency to compromise in 1944. Wikipedia. After the fall of Viipuri on 20th June, the first engagements west of the city formed around a compact road lattice between Tali, Ihantala, and the Portinhoika crossroads. The ground here narrowed between lakes and marsh, Leidimojärvi and Kerstelanjärvi on one axis, the Vuoksi water system influencing the other. The terrain forced columns onto a few roads where artillery observers had pre-measured distances since spring. Soviet rifle divisions advanced in echelons, tanks, and self-propelled guns in support, with forward detachments probing for gaps. Finnish battalions withdrew by phase lines toward company foxholes already staked in the woods, leaving demolition teams and mines on culverts to delay pursuit. On 21-22 June, Soviet lead regiments tested the new line with battalion attacks under rolling barrages. Guards mortar units fired short salvos as assault guns closed to the village edges. Finnish artillery groups responded with rapid concentrations on road entries and assembly clearings, shifting fire by prearranged code to conserve registration rounds. Assault gun companies took positions at likely armor avenues, holding their fire to 300-600 meters. Infantry squads integrated Panzerfausts along ditches and house corners, creating short-range ambush points that complemented the guns. Air sorties from the 13th Air Army targeted bridges and suspected battery positions, while Finnish fighters concentrated around selected nodes to keep at least one rail link open for ammunition trains. By 23rd June, pressure built along the Portinhoika road. Soviet tanks attempted to force the intersection to break the defensive geometry. Two Finnish counterattacks, each a composite of assault guns, infantry, and engineers, retook lost houses and cut a shallow penetration before renewed artillery forced them back to the hedgerows. The exchange reflected asymmetric resources. The attacker could replenish companies and bring up additional guns overnight. The defender relied on timed concentrations and short counterpunches to reset the line without spending irreplaceable reserves. Civilians still in outlying villages used cart tracks to move west under military escort, while civil defense teams cleared splinters from station yards to keep sidings usable. Night actions expanded as both commands exploited the short northern darkness. Soviet reconnaissance units infiltrated tree lines to mark crossing points for morning battalions. Finnish patrols laid additional mines and dragged logs onto road shoulders to narrow tank movement. At dawn on 24th June, a coordinated Soviet attempt hit on a broader frontage. Rifle battalions advanced behind smoke. Assault guns fired direct at suspected machine gun pits. Sappers worked to breach anti-tank ditches with fascines. Finnish batteries answered with multi-battalion fires that struck march columns at road bends, guided by observers who had rehearsed range ladders through the spring. Several tanks reached the outskirts of Tali, trading fire with assault guns across fields measured earlier for elevation tables. The local front bent but did not open. Air activity on 24 to 25 June intensified. Detachment Kulmi, now operating at strength from Finnish bases, flew ground attack sorties against bridges and assembly areas east of Tali, while Finnish fighters patrolled above the road knots. Bombing runs timed with artillery barrages disrupted at least 2 attempts to shift fresh battalions into the forest lanes north of the crossroads. The Soviet side adjusted by moving columns through woods off the road shoulders, but the soft ground slowed heavy vehicles and lengthened timing between echelons. Where the terrain permitted, self-propelled guns engaged from hull-down positions at field edges, while infantry closed to grenade range under the noise of rocket artillery. On the 25th of June, a penetration developed south of Ihantala when a regiment, supported by tanks, forced a Finnish company back from a line of farm buildings. The situation report identified a risk to the lateral road behind the sector. A counter-attack group assembled from an infantry battalion, attached assault guns, and a pioneer platoon struck along a wooded path that avoided open ground. Artillery lifted in blocks at 5-minute intervals as the group advanced, then returned to pre-measured targets once friendly units stepped back. The buildings changed hands twice in an afternoon. Casualty evacuation ran along the same narrow road as ammunition resupply, creating traffic conflicts that staff solved with short movement windows marked by signal flags and field telephones. The first days revealed differences in operational pacing. Soviet plans favored keeping pressure on multiple nodes to prevent concentration of Finnish guns. Finnish command favored compressing combat into a few choke points where artillery, assault guns, and infantry anti-tank weapons could be synchronized. The result was a series of compact engagements measured in hundreds of meters rather than sweeping moves. Both sides adapted. Soviet artillery shifted to shorter, intense preparations immediately before assaults to limit time for counter-battery. Finnish observers increased the use of smoke to conceal assault gun redeployments and to cover short withdrawals into secondary foxholes that had been cut into the reverse slopes. Civilian impact was immediate within the artillery fan of the front. Evacuation orders prioritized children, medical patients, and essential machinery from small workshops that could be dismounted and reinstalled farther west. Train schedules at Lapland War and Imatra were adjusted to interleave military trains with evacuation wagons, with platform times kept short to reduce exposure. Municipal authorities recorded damage to waterworks and power lines from blast overpressure and splinters, while fire brigades coordinated with Army engineer units to secure fuel depots against shrapnel ignition. Command relationships solidified under the pressure. The Finnish field headquarters on the Isthmus centralized artillery fire planning at the corps level to ensure that guns could be massed across divisional boundaries without delay. Radio networks used separate circuits for artillery orders, air-ground coordination, and logistics to reduce interference. On the Soviet side, Army artillery headquarters brought additional heavy batteries forward and integrated counter-battery radars and sound ranging where terrain allowed, attempting to neutralize Finnish batteries that were switching positions by night. The tempo of shelling increased across 26 June as both sides committed more guns. By the end of 26th of June, the line from Tali through Ihantala held in a shallow arc. Soviet units had reached within range of the key crossroads and had established several small lodgements beyond the initial Finnish positions. Finnish countermeasures had restored continuity in most sectors, but at the cost of ammunition drawn from central depots faster than planned. The first phase of fighting west of Vyborg thus produced no decisive territorial change, but it fixed the battlefield on a narrow grid of roads and lakes where additional divisions and artillery groups would soon converge. The engagements defined the problems that the next days would escalate, whether assaults could widen beyond choke points, and whether the defender could continue to mass accurate fire at the required moments while sustaining the supply flow over limited rail and road capacity. Escalation followed within days as additional formations reached the narrow front, and both commands raised fire densities. On 27 to 28 June, Soviet Army artillery groups brought forward heavy batteries and guards mortar brigades, enabling preparatory fires that exceeded 100 guns and launchers per kilometer on the most threatened roads. Counter-battery activity intensified as sound ranging and air spotting identified Finnish positions that had been shifting by night. Finnish headquarters responded by completing the concentration of corps and army artillery groups around Tali and Ihantala, integrating field guns, heavy howitzers, and mortars under centralized fire control. By the end of June, Finnish commanders could mass dozens of batteries within minutes on a single target box and then shift fires laterally across divisional boundaries. Ammunition rationing remained in force, but priority lists allowed short surges during counterattacks or when march columns entered pre-measured bends. The tempo of interdiction forced Soviet units to push infantry through woods parallel to roads, which slowed the integration of tanks and reduced the size of assault waves that could deploy simultaneously. The crisis reached a new level on 28 to 30 June when attacks struck on a wider arc from the Portenhoika area to the lanes north of Ihantala. Soviet rifle divisions, supported by separate tank brigades and self-propelled artillery, attempted to compress the Finnish salient by converging advances. Reports from the front noted repeated attempts to seize the Portenhoika crossroads, a node whose capture would have opened a broader road fan to the west. Finnish countermeasures included battalion-sized counterattacks, with assault guns aiming at flanks as infantry used Panzerfausts at short range from ditches and building corners. Coordination depended on radio nets reserved for artillery orders and on prearranged fire schedules broadcast in concise codes to minimize transmission time under jamming and interception. Air participation rose on both sides. The 13th Air Army flew strikes against bridges, sidings, and suspected battery lines. Detachment Kuhlmei and Finnish fighters flew concentrated sorties on days with better visibility, aiming at crossing points and supply loops east of the immediate front. The effect was cumulative rather than decisive, forcing both commands to adjust movement windows and to accept higher maintenance downtime for aircraft operating from forward fields. Logistics strained visibly. Finnish daily ammunition consumption for field artillery climbed above spring ration plans, drawing on depots farther behind the front and requiring tight train scheduling through Lapland and Kouvola. Engineer units repaired rails under intermittent shelling, laid camouflage nets over sidings, and used decoy wagons to absorb air attack. Fuel stocks for assault guns and trucks were managed by strict dispatch lists that prioritized counterattack groups and medical evacuation columns. On the Soviet side, the reopening of the Leningrad railnet allowed replenishment of shells and rockets at a scale that supported multi-day bombardments. But the last kilometers into the attack zones were constrained by road capacity and terrain. To maintain pressure, staff planners staged reserve regiments closer to the line than doctrine usually preferred, accepting higher vulnerability to sudden artillery concentrations. Political decisions intersected with the battlefield. In late June, German assistance was linked to formal assurances from Helsinki that Finland would not conclude a separate peace with the Soviet Union while the aid flowed. The Finnish leadership, balancing immediate military necessity against long-term diplomatic flexibility, accepted a formulation that enabled the continued delivery of aircraft, anti-tank weapons, and ammunition. Within days, additional consignments of Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks entered service, reshaping infantry defense in forests and village edges by allowing squads to defeat tanks at ranges inside 60 meters. The public messaging remained measured. Official communiques described defensive operations and emphasized continuity of government while avoiding commitments beyond what was necessary to secure supplies. From 30 June to 2 July, attacks struck repeatedly at Tali, Ihantala, and along the lanes between the lakes. Soviet units reached several farm lines and forest edges beyond the initial Finnish positions, and at least one battalion-sized penetration threatened to unhinge a lateral road supporting the entire sector. Finnish headquarters responded with a multi-battalion counterattack under dense, short-duration artillery fires. Observers, including air spotters on clearer days, corrected impacts in near real time, using the unified firing tables established during spring. The counterattack restored the line, but consumed planned reserves of shells for the period and required an emergency reallocation from other sectors. Casualty reports on both sides reflected intense close-quarter fighting. Company rosters showed sharp attrition, and medical services operated under movement restrictions caused by cratered roads and periodic interdiction at bridges. The crisis widened geographically as the Leningrad front sought to exploit along adjacent sectors. East of the main battle, attention shifted to the Vuoksi water system, where crossings near Vuo Salmi would, if secured, threaten the Finnish right and pull artillery away from Ihantala. On 30th June and into 1 to 3 July, Soviet units probed along the river, using smoke and local bombardments to cover ferrying attempts. Finnish defenders, supported by guns coordinated from the Isthmus Command, struck crossing sites with prearranged concentrations, timed to coincide with raft arrivals. Both sides recorded losses in boats and bridging equipment. The intent was clear. A firm bridgehead east of the main battle would force Finnish headquarters to split scarce heavy artillery and assault guns. Simultaneously, the Baltic approaches influenced operations on land. In early July, fighting intensified in Vyborg Bay as Soviet naval infantry and army units tested islands and shoreline positions. Landings on narrow fronts aimed to outflank coastal defenses and to pressure the road net behind the Tali Ihantala sector from the north. Finnish coastal artillery and small naval craft contested the moves, while army reserves were kept minimal on the shoreline to avoid weakening the main front. The interplay of bay, river, and road created a three-directional pressure that demanded discipline in allocation. Too much reinforcement to the bay, or the Vuoksi, risked collapse at Ihantala. Too little risked an operational encirclement within weeks. Weather and daylight patterns affected tempo. Short nights limited opportunities for extended redeployments without air observation. And midday heat complicated infantry movement through forest belts. Both sides used early morning and late evening for shuttling batteries and assault guns. Camouflage, smoke, and deception increased in importance. Finnish decoy gun positions drew counter-battery fire that might otherwise have fallen on active batteries, while Soviet dummy bivouacs and false roadwork attempted to divert bombing and artillery harassment. Intelligence on both sides improved. Finnish radio intelligence intercepted fragments of movement orders that, combined with aerial photography, helped predict assault timing, while Soviet reconnaissance adapted to Finnish artillery methods by sending out small teams to locate observation posts and telephone lines. By 3 to 4 July, the crisis had stabilized into a pattern of daily bombardments, local penetrations, and immediate counteractions that consumed ammunition and manpower at rates that planners had not anticipated in spring. Finnish High Command reported that the VKT line still held in the Tali Ihantala sector, but required sustained deliveries of shells and anti-tank munitions to maintain this condition. Soviet Army reports noted progress measured in seized tree lines and farmsteads, yet also recorded the cumulative effect of concentrated defensive fire, particularly where march columns were caught at pre-measured bends. International attention, limited but present through neutral diplomatic channels, focused on whether the fighting would force a political decision in Helsinki. The escalation and the mounting costs created the background against which the next phase would unfold. Attempts to achieve a decisive break under the heaviest concentrations of artillery and air power that the theater had yet seen, while a parallel contest developed on the Vuoksi and in Vyborg Bay. From 4 to 7th July, the fighting reached its highest density in the Ihantala Tali sector. Both commands concentrated artillery and aviation to a degree not previously seen on the Isthmus. Soviet rifle divisions, strengthened by tank brigades and self-propelled gun regiments, attempted to compress the Finnish salient from north and south toward the road knot at Portenhoika. Fire plans began before dawn, with heavy and medium artillery, guards mortar salvos, and timed shifts onto suspected headquarters and battery positions. Forward battalions moved behind smoke screens onto narrow corridors between lakes where engineers had marked gaps in minefields. Finnish headquarters replied by massing corps and army artillery groups across divisional boundaries, executing multi-battalion concentrations on assembly woods, road bends, and crossing points measured in spring. The method emphasized short, simultaneous bursts rather than prolonged barrages, drawing on unified firing tables to correct rapidly from air and ground observers. On the 4th July, a Soviet thrust reached lines north of Tali after pushing through a farm complex under direct fire from assault guns. The Finnish counterstroke used an infantry battalion with attached Stu-G-3s and engineers. Artillery lifted in blocks along a prearranged ladder, then returned as the counterattack stepped back. The farm changed hands twice before the front stabilized along the adjacent tree line. Losses included tanks disabled at short range by Panzerfausts from ditches and barn corners, as well as assault guns knocked out by direct hits from self-propelled guns firing from field edges. Medical columns shared the same few roads as ammunition trucks. Movement control posts enforced timed windows with signal flags to prevent traffic locks under shelling. Air participation peaked as weather cleared. The 13th Air Army flew interdiction and close support against bridges, sidings, and battery areas, while Finnish fighters and detachment Kulmi concentrated on columns forming east of the front and on ferry sites. Bombing synchronized with artillery disrupted several attempts to rotate fresh regiments into the forest lanes. Aircraft maintenance cycles shortened to sustain sortie rates, and improvised repair teams worked on the forward airfields under camouflage nets. The effect on timing was measurable. Planned assaults that required 2 regiment fronts often went forward with 1 reinforced regiment, when the second arrived late due to interdiction or road blockage. On the 3rd July, a series of attacks pressed simultaneously against Ihantala's northern approaches and the Portinhoika crossroads. Soviet infantry advanced under cover of smoke with tanks in support. Sappers dragged fascines toward anti-tank ditches cut across the approaches. Finnish artillery answered with concentrations cued by observers who had pre-registered every visible field and road segment. Assault guns engaged at 300-600 meters, then displaced under smoke to avoid counter-battery and direct fire. Company positions withdrew by bounds to reverse slope foxholes previously dug in spring field work. The day closed with the line roughly where it had opened, but both sides reported significant ammunition, expenditure, and attrition in rifle companies. As pressure mounted on the central node, the Leningrad front widened the effort. At Vuo Salmi on the Vuoksi, Soviet units forced crossings beginning 4th July under strong artillery cover. Finnish defenders struck ferry points with prearranged fires, but a bridgehead formed on the western bank by 6th July. Attempts to expand it met counterattacks coordinated from the Isthmus Artillery Command, which shifted heavy batteries temporarily from Ihantala to break up concentrations inside the pocket. The trade-off was explicit. Preserving Ihantala's integrity required accepting risk on the river, while compressing the bridgehead demanded temporary thinning of guns at the main battle. The result was a contained salient at Vuo Salmi that drew in forces without collapsing the Finnish right. Simultaneously in Vyborg Bay, Soviet naval infantry and army units renewed landings on islands and shoreline positions. Finnish coastal artillery and small craft contested approaches, while limited army reserves counterattacked narrow lodgements. The bay operations compelled Finnish headquarters to maintain a minimum garrison along the coast, and to assign artillery sectors to deter a drive on the road net behind the main front. The 3 axes, bay, river, and roads between lakes, required constant recalculation of reserves, shells, and engineer assets. On the 6th of July, Soviet attacks attempted to interlock gains at several points. A push south of Ihantala penetrated a forest strip, threatening the lateral road that supported artillery displacement. Finnish response combined a curtain of smoke, a 2-company counterattack on a narrow frontage, and a timed artillery box that closed behind the attacking companies. The maneuver restored the road, but consumed a large share of that day's allowable artillery expenditure. Reports noted that rifle companies on both sides were operating at reduced strengths after repeated engagements. Replacement drafts arrived, but integration under fire limited their immediate effectiveness. High command decisions reflected the pressure. Mannerheim and the Isthmus commander prioritized ammunition for set-piece counterattacks, and interdiction on 5 pre-selected road segments where aerial photography showed routine congestion. German deliveries of anti-tank weapons continued, increasing the share of Panzerfausts in frontline platoons and shaping tactics toward close-in engagements in broken terrain. On the Soviet side, Army artillery brought additional heavy batteries into range and intensified counter-battery using sound ranging and flash spotting to target Finnish guns that had been shifting by night. The exchange raised daily shell use above previous averages, compelling both commands to adjust ration tables and train schedules. Civilian conditions behind the front deteriorated within the range of long-range guns and air attack. Evacuation from exposed villages continued by rail and truck, with lists prioritizing children, medical patients, and specialized machine tools from small workshops. Municipal services recorded interruptions to power and water. Repair crews worked under curfews coordinated with air raid alarms. Hospitals in Lapland War and Imatra reorganized wards to absorb surgical cases from Ihantala and Vuo Salmi, while blood and plasma stocks were shuttled by night to reduce exposure. By 7th of July, the peak phase had produced measurable but limited territorial change. Soviet forces held several shallow salients touching the approaches to Ihantala and maintained the bridgehead at Vuo Salmi. Finnish formations retained control of the primary road grid west of Vyborg and kept artillery and assault gun groups intact, though at the cost of high ammunition consumption and unit fatigue. The battlefield logic favored continued pressure from the attacker and continued concentration from the defender. Whether the next set of assaults would achieve a breakthrough or whether the defender's fire system would impose a culminating point remained contingent on two variables now visible in daily logs: the ability to maintain shell flow to the front and the ability to time artillery and aviation to disrupt march columns before deployment. The days that followed would test these variables under the heaviest synchronized strikes of the campaign. Adaptation defined the next week as both commands adjusted tactics, logistics, and information flow to sustain operations under high-density fire. Finnish headquarters refined artillery control beyond divisional boundaries. Fire direction centers linked corps and army groups through common firing tables so that a request from a single forward observer could trigger simultaneous concentrations from batteries positioned kilometers apart. Observers rehearsed coded corrections that reduced radio time and exposure to interception. On 8th and 9th of July, this method produced several sudden strikes on march columns east of Ihantala, when reconnaissance aircraft and ground observers confirmed vehicles massing at known bends. Shell allotments were still rationed, but the timing and density of the bursts offset the lower total expenditure compared to the attacker's average daily fires. Infantry adapted around new anti-tank densities. Platoons integrated Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks into every squad, with 2 to 4 launchers per section in some companies by mid-July. Assault drills shifted to exploit short forest sightlines. A 2-man team engaged the lead tank at 30 to 50 meters, while a second team aimed at vehicles halted by obstacles or craters. Assault gun crews modified positions by cutting shallow pits for lower silhouettes, and by prelaying smoke to cover short bounds to new hull-down points. Engineer detachments multiplied log cribs and abadis across side tracks to channel armor into pre-measured kill zones. Reports noted reduced ammunition, wastage as range discipline tightened, and as commanders reserved armor-piercing rounds for targets that could not be handled by infantry weapons. Soviet formations adjusted as well. Assault echelons broke into smaller packets to reduce vulnerability to area fires. Attacks moved with shorter artillery preparations, followed by rapid pushes to avoid giving defenders time to mass guns. Night reconnaissance increased, with patrols marking bypasses through woods to reach the flanks of Finnish positions at dawn. Engineer units brought forward more bridging materials to keep pace with cratered roads and demolished culverts. Flamethrower teams were attached to assault groups for clearing houses and log shelters at the forest edge, and additional smokestocks were issued to cover sappers at anti-tank ditches. Air and counter-air routines evolved. The 13th Air Army shifted to more numerous but shorter strikes on bridges and sidings to complicate repair cycles. Finnish fighters altered patrol timing to overlap with artillery interdiction windows, while Detachment Kulmi focused on road knots where photography showed habitual congestion in late afternoon. Maintenance teams on both sides streamlined turnaround by standardizing bomb loads on common targets to speed arming. On 9 to 10 July, several coordinated bombings coincided with Finnish artillery to trap columns at forest exits north of the Portenhoika Road, delaying a scheduled attack until evening and forcing a launch with reduced infantry strength. Communications discipline became a combat multiplier. Finnish signal units ran redundant landlines for artillery and logistics, while limiting radio power to reduce direction finding. Camouflage expanded to include dummy aerials and decoy command posts that drew counter-battery and bombing away from active nodes. Soviet countermeasures included increased use of wire within assault sectors and portable radio sets for forward controllers to call fire on detected Finnish batteries. Sound ranging and flash spotting units worked closer to the front to shorten response times. Both sides reported improved counter-battery results compared to late June. Logistics absorbed continuous stress and prompted improvisation. Finnish ammunition trains were scheduled in tight windows around Lapland and Kouvola, with engineer crews prepositioned to relay damaged tracks and swap out points under intermittent shelling. Depots broke down deliveries into smaller lots carried by dispersed trucks to limit single-point losses. Fuel allocations prioritized assault gun companies, medical evacuation, and rail repair detachments. Non-essential movement was curtailed. Captured munitions were segregated and issued with clear handling instructions where calibers matched. On the Soviet side, the reopened lines around Leningrad allowed steady flow of shells and rockets to forward parks. But the last kilometers remained a bottleneck. Staff solved some of this by forward staging regiments and rotating battalions more quickly, accepting higher exposure to interdiction in exchange for tempo. Morale management was explicit. Finnish units rotated rifle companies off the line for 24 to 48-hour rest when possible, establishing hot meal points and medical checks within artillery range but under camouflage. Mail delivery and brief chaplain services continued where terrain permitted. Psychological support consisted of clear situation briefings to reduce rumors and of recognition for small unit actions that restored positions. Soviet formations used political officers and unit newspapers to explain objectives and to counter defeatist talk after heavy losses in segments caught by massed artillery. Replacements were integrated directly in forward companies with quick refresher drills on close-in anti-tank tactics or street-to-forest transitions. Medical services adapted triage and evacuation routes. Finnish field hospitals standardized protocols for blast and shrapnel wounds and increased the use of plasma, while surgical teams moved forward under camouflage nets when road conditions allowed. Evacuation chains used the same narrow roads as ammunition columns, so movement control posts enforced alternating windows. Soviet medical battalions set up behind wooded crests and shifted as front lines moved, relying on stretcher relays through forest strips to reach vehicle pickup points. Both sides documented shortages in dressings and anesthetics during peak days and compensated with pooled stocks at corps level. Civilian authorities behind the front adjusted procedures to maintain essential services under bombardment. Evacuations continued from villages within long-range gun arcs, with lists prioritizing children, patients, and precision tools from small factories that could be reinstalled farther west. Fire brigades coordinated with military engineers to protect fuel depots and waterworks. Repair crews worked at night to reduce air observation. Public messages emphasized shelter usage and train timetables while avoiding operational detail. Information operations sought to shape expectations. Soviet communiques highlighted local advances and the maintenance of a bridgehead across the Vuoksi to signal operational reach. Finnish statements focused on the defensive character of operations, the continuity of constitutional government, and the measured integration of external assistance without committing to long-term political outcomes. Leaflet drops occurred in both directions, urging surrender or persistence. Their material effect was limited compared to artillery and logistics, but they formed part of the psychological environment recorded in unit diaries. By 10 to 11 July, the operational picture reflected these adaptations. At Ihantala, Finnish artillery could deliver multi-source, near simultaneous concentrations that caught echelons before deployment, while infantry anti-tank weapons denied tanks freedom on narrow lanes. At Vuo Salmi, the bridgehead persisted, but remained contained by crossfires and periodic counterattacks, synced with heavy guns, temporarily diverted from the main sector. In Vyborg Bay, narrow landings forced the defender to hold small reserves on the coastline, but these did not strip the central front of essential assets. The attacker retained the ability to renew assaults with fresh battalions and to apply sustained artillery, yet found that progress measured in tree lines demanded disproportionate time under fire. The psychological toll was evident but managed. Company reports recorded reduced strengths and fatigue, yet also noted that the predictability of terrain and fire support fostered confidence in set-piece counterattacks. Soviet reports cited the need to reorganize under fire and to expand night movement to counter daytime interdiction. Neither command assumed collapse on the other side. Both prepared for continued attrition while evaluating whether the concentration of force could still produce a decisive breach. The period thus became one of resistance and adaptation in exact terms. New firing protocols, revised assault group compositions, reweighted logistics, and adjusted information measures. These changes did not end the battle. They altered its tempo, narrowed its avenues, and set conditions for the decision that would follow when one side reached its culminating point under synchronized artillery and air pressure. The turning point emerged between 9 and 12 July, when the attackers' attempts to compress the Ihantala sector met a coordinated defensive system that reached full effect. Before dawn on 9 July, Soviet artillery and Guards mortar units opened with short, intense preparations on observation posts, suspected battery lines, and road nodes, followed by assaults aimed at Portenhoika and the forest lanes north of Ihantala. Finnish headquarters responded by massing corps and army artillery groups across divisional boundaries within minutes. Observers triggered simultaneous concentrations from dispersed batteries using common firing tables. Air spotters confirmed impacts where cloud permitted. Several march columns entering pre-measured road bends were struck before deployment, and counter-battery fire forced Soviet guns to displace without completing longer programs. Assault echelons that did reach the forward tree lines found assault guns and infantry anti-tank teams positioned for engagements at 3,600 meters, with smoke covering short bounds to new hull-down points. By evening, the front stood close to its morning line, but reports recorded high ammunition expenditure on both sides and a measurable delay in planned follow-on attacks. On 10 July, the Leningrad front renewed pressure on a wide frontage, combining attacks at Ihantala with efforts to expand the Vuo Salmi bridgehead. The operational plan sought to strain the defenders' artillery by forcing lateral shifts between the river and the road lattice. Finnish command answered by enforcing a fixed priority list. Interdiction of 5 identified congestion points east of Ihantala, immediate counter-battery on batteries detected by sound ranging, and time blocks on likely crossing hours at Vuo Salmi. Detachment Kulme and Finnish fighters flew against road knots and ferry approaches in windows coordinated with artillery. The cumulative outcome was a series of stalled deployments. Battalion diaries on both sides noted repeated advances to limited objectives, followed by withdrawal under concentrated fire. The Vuo Salmi bridgehead survived but remained shallow. Attempts to widen it beyond immediate cover were checked by temporary massing of heavy guns, shifted from Ihantala, then returned west once the river sector stabilized. By 11 July, indicators of culmination appeared in staff records. Soviet units reported delays in getting second echelon regiments into position due to interdicted road segments and cratered forest tracks. Engineer reports listed higher than planned fascine and bridging consumption and repeated repairs of the same crossings. Tank and self-propelled gun units noted increased losses to short-range anti-tank weapons in woods and village edges, with reduced freedom to maneuver off roads. Finnish logs recorded sustained shell flow to the isthmus only by strict train scheduling and night road movement, but they also recorded that daily allotments could still be met at the expense of other sectors. Rifle company strengths were reduced on both sides. Replacements arrived, yet their immediate effect under fire was limited. On 12 July, a major attempt to break the Ihantala defense failed to achieve a penetration beyond battalion depth. Artillery preparations were shorter to preserve ammunition and to limit defender reaction time. Assault battalions advanced under smoke, but observers brought down simultaneous concentrations on assembly woods and road exits. Assault guns engaged at prearranged ranges. Infantry anti-tank teams targeted the lead vehicles to create blockages. Counterattacks struck within minutes at the shoulders of shallow salients, covered by smoke and timed fireboxes that closed behind the attacking companies. By late day, reports from the Leningrad front indicated that immediate objectives were not secured, and that further gains would require additional artillery stocks and rotation of depleted rifle units. Finnish command concluded that the main sector had reached a balance favorable to continued defense if ammunition could be sustained. Parallel developments reinforced the sense of a turning point. At Vuo Salmi, the bridgehead neither collapsed nor expanded decisively. Finnish counterattack, supported by heavy artillery, kept the pocket constrained to a limited frontage. Soviet artillery protected the lodgment and enabled local improvements, but the crossing did not unhinge the VKT line. In Vyborg Bay, landings continued on islands and shore positions, but coastal artillery and small reserves restricted their operational effect to tying down forces. The cumulative picture showed pressure on 3 axes without decisive gain on any one of them. For Helsinki, this meant that the army had preserved the core of its artillery, assault guns, and command system after the loss of Viipuri, and could continue to hold the VKT line for a period measured in weeks if supplies held. For the Leningrad front, it meant that time costs on the Isthmus were rising relative to other theaters where large operations were underway. Operational decisions followed. Finnish High Command fixed artillery priorities for the remainder of July, interdiction of approach routes at specified hours, counter-battery on batteries identified by sound ranging and aerial photography, and immediate short-duration fires to cover company counterattacks. Assault guns were held as mobile reserves to strike armor on lateral roads, rather than being tied to single strongpoints. Infantry platoons standardized anti-tank drills and tightened range discipline to conserve shape-charge stocks. On the Soviet side, Army artillery regrouped to maintain pressure with shorter programs and to support limited objective attacks intended to wear down defenders rather than to achieve a single breakthrough. Night movement increased to mitigate daytime interdiction, and additional smoke was allocated to sappers at anti-tank ditches. Political and strategic calculations shifted accordingly. On 12–13 July, Helsinki assessed that the front would likely hold if munitions continued to arrive and if losses did not force sudden sector thinning. German deliveries of anti-tank weapons and aviation support continued under the political formula accepted in late June, but the leadership now had operational grounds to consider diplomatic options once the immediate crisis passed. Diplomatic channels in Stockholm and elsewhere, muted during the first weeks of the offensive, reopened for preliminary soundings on terms. For Moscow, the calculus included the security of Leningrad and the desire to end Finnish participation in the war, but also the allocation of resources to other fronts where higher priorities had been set for summer operations. By mid-July, front-level orders emphasized maintaining contact and pressure, consolidating gains, and exploiting opportunities rather than committing to another high-cost push against the same narrow road lattice. Evidence of culmination continued through 13–15 July. Attempts to renew attacks around Ihantala encountered rapid artillery concentrations and close-in anti-tank defenses that prevented the formation of a deep wedge. Artillery expenditure by the defender remained high, but within usable limits due to disciplined rationing and successful train scheduling. Air operations persisted on both sides, with shorter, more frequent strikes aimed at rail nodes and bridges rather than extended bombing runs. In unit diaries, the tempo shifted from continuous large-scale assaults to frequent local actions and counteractions, with front lines moving by tens to hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. This turning point did not end the campaign. It fixed its trajectory. The attacker retained significant artillery and manpower, held Viipuri, and kept a bridgehead over the Vuoksi. The defender controlled the central road grid west of Viipuri, maintained the coherence of the VKT line at Ihantala, and kept the bridgehead contained. Crucially, the defender preserved the initiative in fire timing. Artillery and aviation could still be synchronized to disrupt deployments at known choke points. This combination of intact command, sufficient ammunition flow, and operationally effective geography allowed Helsinki to move from crisis management to planning for an armistice once a political transition could be arranged. In practical terms, the decision space widened from days to weeks. The fighting would continue with costly engagements, but the probability of a sudden operational collapse on the Isthmus receded. The decisive change was thus not a single dramatic event, but the convergence in a few days of mid-July of artillery method, anti-tank density, and logistics control that arrested the attackers' momentum and created conditions for a political pivot. Through mid-July, the front on the isthmus settled into repeated local actions without deep movement, while the bridgehead at Vuo Salmi remained contained. On 16th to 18th July, assaults at Ihantala failed to produce a penetration beyond battalion depth. Artillery and air interdiction continued to arrest deployments at road bends and forest exits. The Leningrad front retained Vyborg and held a foothold west of the Vuoksi, but the projected exploitation toward Lake Saimaya did not materialize. For the Finnish command, this stabilization provided the time needed for a political transition. On 1 to 28th July, President Risto Ryti carried the burden of a written commitment to Germany to continue the war while aid flowed. On 28th July, he resigned, allowing the state to shift policy without repudiating a personal pledge. The parliament elected Mannerheim president on the 4th of August, after which preliminary approaches on an armistice resumed. Combat persisted during the political turn. At Vuo Salmi, attempts on 17 to 20th July to widen the bridgehead were checked by counterattacks, and massed artillery temporarily shifted from Ihantala. On the coast, actions in Vyborg Bay forced the defender to maintain a narrow coastal reserve, but did not unhinge the road net behind the main battle. By late July, front reports on both sides recorded fatigue, high ammunition consumption, and reduced company strengths. August brought smaller, methodical attacks and counterattacks, patrol activity, and artillery harassment. The VKT line remained intact in the Ihantala sector. The Leningrad front maintained pressure, but faced competing demands from other theaters and the cumulative time cost of further concentration on the same narrow ground. Diplomatic exchanges accelerated in the second half of August. On 25 to 29th August, Helsinki signaled readiness to discuss terms. On 29th August, a formal request for an armistice went forward. Active operations continued while envoys worked. On 3 September, with negotiations advanced, the Finnish command issued orders to cease fire on the Soviet front at a prescribed hour to demonstrate compliance while retaining discipline under possible last-minute changes. At 07 Uhren on the 4th September, Finnish forces on the Soviet front halted offensive actions and lowered rates of return fire to minimums directed by corps commanders. The Soviet side observed a different clock. Widespread firing persisted into the following day, and a formal ceasefire on the Soviet side took effect on the morning of 5th September after Oiksiu. The intervening hours produced additional casualties in sectors exposed to artillery and on the Vyborg Bay approaches, a result of the offset orders and the difficulty of transmitting instructions along disrupted communications. The withdrawal phase unfolded by schedule. Finnish formations retained their positions on the VKT line until verification of compliance, then began thinning forward trenches, pulling back assault guns and heavy artillery to designated assembly areas. Engineers cleared roadblocks on lateral routes to speed redeployment away from the front and to facilitate handover points foreseen in the armistice framework. Ammunition remaining in forward depots was tallied and transported rearward. Unusable stocks were recorded for destruction under supervision. Medical evacuation concluded for cases that could be moved. Field hospitals consolidated into larger facilities at Lapland War and Kouvola. On the Soviet side, frontline units secured their lodgements and recorded captured materiel. Artillery fire plans were suspended, and counter-battery units stood down after confirmation orders arrived. Patrols monitored the Finnish pullback without attempting to exploit it, reflecting the political context in which military actions now took place. Immediate humanitarian consequences were measurable. Evacuations from areas west of the old 1940 frontier that had been held during the summer now became permanent departures. Civil authorities processed flows of civilians already displaced by bombardment, along with households from districts that would be ceded under the armistice. Registration points collected data on families, property, and agricultural equipment. Trains moved evacuees toward interior provinces according to capacity. The number of relocated civilians from Karelia and adjacent ceded zones reached several 100,000 by autumn, requiring large-scale resettlement plans, new land allocations, and emergency housing. Municipal utilities behind the former front repaired power and water lines, cleared unexploded munitions from station yards, and reopened essential services under rationing. The armistice with the Soviet Union, signed in Moscow on 19th September, formalized the end of combat operations on this front and specified the immediate post-battle arrangements. Territorial clauses restored the 1940 border and ceded the Petsamo-Pichenga area. A 50-year lease granted the USSR a naval base at Porkkala near Helsinki, with evacuation timetables for affected residents. Reparations were set at 300 million United States dollars, 1938 value, payable in goods such as ships, machinery, timber, and paper over a multi-year schedule. The Finnish armed forces were to demobilize to peacetime strength under a defined timetable, intern or disband organizations labeled fascist, and release political prisoners identified in the text. An Allied Control Commission, chaired by the Soviet Union with British participation, would supervise compliance from headquarters in Helsinki. The agreement also required Finland to remove or disarm German forces on its territory by a near-term date, a clause that carried direct military implications in the north. This last requirement created a second withdrawal and an immediate new front in Lapland. German 20th Mountain Army in northern Finland and northern Norway had already prepared evacuation plans tied to Germany's broader strategic retreat. In September, orders from Helsinki directed German units to depart by a set deadline. German command initiated staged withdrawals along pre-planned routes, while blowing bridges and laying mines to slow pursuit. Attempts to avoid open fighting encountered friction. On 15th September, German forces attempted to seize the island of Suursaari, Hogland, in the Gulf of Finland to secure the sea route. Finnish coastal and army units repulsed the landing with losses on both sides, hardening the situation. By late September, skirmishes between Finnish and German detachments marked the start of the Lapland War, which would continue into 1945 and lead to extensive destruction of infrastructure in the north as German forces retreated toward Norway. On the Isthmus and in southeastern Finland, demobilization began in stages once the Allied Control Commission confirmed compliance on ceasefire lines. Rifle divisions reduced to cadres, artillery groups turned in guns according to inventory lists. Assault gun units parked vehicles for inspection. Border security units replaced field formations along new lines. The Air Force grounded combat units pending verification and reorganized for peacetime tasks within armistice limits. War materiel subject to destruction or handover was secured under guard. Inventories were cross-checked against front-level records to avoid discrepancies that could be interpreted as violations. Civilian administration faced tasks scaled by the magnitude of territorial change. The Viipuri region and Ladoga Karelia, lost in 1940 and retaken in 1941, were again ceded, this time with an added northern loss. Property compensation mechanisms were reactivated and expanded. Agricultural resettlement programs divided state and large private lands in the interior to create new farms for Karelian evacuees. Industrial towns absorbed skilled workers into factories that would help fulfill reparations. Municipal services in areas near Porkkala adjusted to the presence of a foreign-leased base within commuting distance of the capital, modifying road networks and public transport schedules, and relocating schools and clinics from the leased zone. Military and political accounting followed quickly. Casualty registers on the Isthmus and adjacent sectors were updated through September, recording killed, wounded, and missing for units engaged at Tali, Ihantala, Vuo Salmi, and Vyborg Bay. Prisoner exchanges began under armistice procedures. Parliamentary debates and official white papers reviewed the decisions taken since January, the constraints imposed by logistics and coalition politics, and the outcomes in territory, casualties, and sovereignty. Neither command framed the summer as a clear-cut victory or defeat within their public narratives. Instead, each pointed to concrete results. The Soviet Union secured the approaches to Leningrad, enforced territorial and strategic conditions, and ended Finland's co-belligerency. Finland preserved independent state institutions in Helsinki and retained an army nucleus within armistice limits. By the end of September, the summer campaign on the Isthmus had closed as an active front. The lines that had once focused artillery and armor now served as reference points for inspectors and survey teams, charting cleared minefields and demolished positions. Rail yards shifted from mixed military traffic to reparations goods and resettlement trains. The withdrawal and immediate aftermath thus consisted of synchronized military stand-down, territorial transfer, and social reorganization. The consequences extended into new operations in Lapland and into the economy through reparations schedules. But the central outcome of the 1944 pivot was visible in Helsinki's daily orders. The Army's task moved from holding a narrow map, square west of Vyborg, to implementing an armistice that kept the state functioning under stringent conditions. The campaign's military logic, logistics, artillery control, and terrain had enabled a controlled end to fighting. The political logic now governed how a smaller Finland would manage the terms in the months to come. The summer campaign on the Karelian Isthmus left a layered legacy that combined military method, state survival under constraint, and a durable recalibration of foreign policy. On the battlefield, the sequence from the breach of the VT line to the halt at the VKT line validated specific defensive techniques under material inferiority. Centralized artillery control using common firing tables, rapid corrections, and cross-divisional massing, procedures refined by Finnish artillery leadership, demonstrated that dispersed batteries could deliver simultaneous concentrations with limited shells if observation and communications were preserved. The pairing of assault guns and short counterattacks with widespread platoon-level anti-tank launchers showed that armor could be denied freedom on forest roads without large tank formations. Air-ground timing that fixed march columns at predictable road bends illustrated the operational value of interdiction windows, even when total sortie numbers favored the attacker. For the Soviet side, the offensive confirmed that sustained artillery density, engineers in close support, and combined arms echelons could break prepared belts and take major objectives such as Vyborg, but also revealed the time and ammunition costs of pressing attacks through lake and forest terrain once the defender established a functioning fire system. Loss accounting shaped interpretations that followed. Finnish staff tallies for the Tali Ihantala, and adjacent actions recorded several thousand killed and a larger number wounded. Soviet operational summaries reported higher absolute losses given the scale of committed units. Exact figures diverged by source because reporting counted different date brackets and sectors, but the comparative pattern remained consistent. The attacker expended more personnel and ammunition per kilometer gained after 20 June than during the initial breakthrough. The bridgehead at Vuo Salmi, held by Soviet forces on the west bank of the Vuoksi, became a case study in constrained lodgements that tied down artillery and infantry without yielding an operational opening if road networks behind the defender remain intact. Vyborg Bay operations highlighted the limits of narrow amphibious thrusts against prepared coastal artillery when the main road net can still be held from inland nodes. Political outcomes were defined in dated instruments. The 19 September 1944 armistice restored the 1940 frontier, transferred Petsamo, and imposed a 50-year lease on Porkala near Helsinki. The base affected commuter patterns and rail routing until its return in 1956 under a bilateral agreement. Reparations fixed at $300 million United States dollars in 1938 value, payable in goods, required a multi-year industrial effort. Shipyards, metal works, and woodworking capacity were retooled to meet schedules, with deliveries continuing into the early 1950s. The Allied Control Commission supervised demobilization and legal measures, including the dissolution of organizations labeled fascist. The requirement to remove or disarm German forces generated the Lapland War, which ended with the departure of German 20th Mountain Army into Norway by April 1945. The price included systematic destruction of bridges, rail lines, and housing stock in northern municipalities. Domestic politics adjusted to armistice supervision and post-war law. The presidency changed hands as Mannerheim, elected in August 1944 to steer the transition, resigned in March 1946 for health reasons. Juho Kusti Paasikivi succeeded him and negotiated the 1947 peace treaty in Paris, which confirmed borders, set forced ceilings, and formalized reparations. War responsibility trials in 1945-1946 sentenced several leaders under parliamentary statutes enacted after the armistice, with sentences calibrated to the political context of the time. Land policy addressed the resettlement of evacuees from ceded territories. Several 100,000 people received plots through post-war land acquisition laws, restructuring rural property, and shaping electoral and social patterns for a generation. Veterans' benefits, pensions, and medical services expanded in steps as budget and treaty ceilings allowed. Foreign policy consolidated around treaty obligations and predictable conduct with the Soviet Union. The 1948 Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance codified commitments that constrained defense policy while allowing neutrality in conflicts not involving Finland directly. Over subsequent decades, the Paasikivi-Kekkonen line balanced security assurances with trade links west and east. Shipbuilding, machinery, and paper exports served reparations and then regular commerce. In this frame, the events of 1944 were cited domestically as the point at which state continuity was preserved at the cost of territory and long-term obligations. For the Soviet Union, the outcome secured Leningrad's approaches, gained bases and borders acceptable to its leadership, and removed a belligerent from the northern flank as resources were reallocated to campaigns elsewhere. Military institutions drew specific lessons. Finnish doctrinal publications emphasized observation discipline, fire planning that crossed subordinate boundaries, and pre-measured choke points in lake-dense terrain. Training manuals integrated short-range anti-tank drills for infantry and the use of smoke to protect assault gun displacement. Engineer planning prioritized duplicative bridge sets and rapid road repair under fire. Soviet after-action studies examined the need for faster road construction in forest belts, more bridging and fascine stocks in the assault echelons, and improved coordination between artillery programs and second echelon deployment to avoid congestion at exits under interdiction. Both sides recorded that counter-battery effectiveness increased when sound ranging and flash spotting were moved forward with better camouflage and rapid displacement. Memory and commemoration reflected varied experiences. In Finland, Tali, Ihantala, Vuo Salmi, and coastal actions entered the calendar of remembrance with veteran associations, plaques, and annual ceremonies that stress service in a defensive campaign and the restoration of peace under treaty control. In the Soviet and later Russian historiography, the Vyborg's Petrozavodsk Offensive and the seizure of Vyborg were placed within Leningrad's security narrative and the broader summer operations of 1944. Scholarly debates compared operational decisions on both sides, whether earlier evacuation of forward belts might have preserved more forces for the VKT fight, whether deeper initial artillery densities might have compressed defender options sooner, and how the coexistence of three axes, roads, river, and bay, shaped allocation choices that precluded a single decisive thrust. Cartography and public history integrated the campaign into maps and exhibitions that emphasize physical constraints. Overlays of lakes, marsh, and the Vuoksi water system show why front lines stabilized where they did. Annotated timelines from January to September 1944 trace the link between logistics ledgers, ammunition days on hand, rail tonnage, fuel allocations, and battlefield tempos at specific crossroads west of Vyborg. Museum displays pair items from both sides, a Finnish firing table sheet and a Soviet engineer fascine marker, a Panzerfaust tube and a guard mortar casing, a field telephone directory, and a sound-ranging record. The material culture underlines that the pivot from co-belligerency to compromise was executed by units whose problems were measured in minutes, meters, and tonnage, while cabinets translated those constraints into treaties, leases, and reparations accounts. The legacy is thus a sequence that remains internally consistent across perspectives. Militarily, the attacker demonstrated the capacity to break fortified lines and take a major city, while the defender proved able to halt further exploitation by concentrating fires at a narrow road lattice. Politically, the Soviet Union obtained borders, a leased base, and an end to Finnish participation in the war. Finland retained independent institutions, demobilized under supervision, and reoriented policy to treaty-compliant neutrality. Socially and economically, evacuee resettlement and reparations restructured labor, land, and industry. The campaign's significance lies not in a single verdict, but in the demonstration that logistics, terrain, and artillery method can translate battlefield outcomes into political space, within which states craft compromises that outlast the guns that created them.